comes out of me when I write, constructing itself to infinity, is an organization of the human outside the species. Black, grimy, the blackest possible and hence already dazzling, golden because of its dazzling blackness, tormented above all by man's cruelty to man, by war, hunger, torture, massacres, prostitution. I'm not saying that what I write is a denunciation of horror of any kind of hell. It is the greatest blackness, through the greatest blackness and hence the greatest possible gleam. Pierre Guyotat. If Eden, Eden, Eden is an unprecedented text, it is important to properly determine its singularity with regard to what has been done before with words. Guyotat is not a transgressive writer, celebrating the unleashing of forbidden desire. Indeed, nothing could be further from the melodrama of transgression than the precisely calibrated rhythms, the measured impassivity of Guyotat's exacting prose. Yet nor is he simply a Lucretian materialist, forensically exposing the elemental reality which we can only experience as monstrous. Eden, 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 and its evacuation of psychology, narrative, and socio-historical contextualization, its reduction of human activity to a multiple series of discontinuous physical acts, its abolition of past and future and contraction of tense to an endlessly protracted present, all have encouraged the claim that this radically materialist text is what it is, a Lucretian ode hymning to the fatal declension of bodies conjoining and disjoining in the void, before and after history, society, narrative, ideology. There is certainly something to this characterization of Guyotat's accomplishment. It has partially been encouraged by Guyotat himself, for example his claim that Eden, Eden, Eden had exhausted the materialist conception of life. Badiou characterizes Guyotat's greatest books as Lucretian in The Logic of Worlds. However, Badiou offers a more nuanced account in his book Pierre Guyotat, Prince of Prose. But I believe it is an oversimplification, traducing its complexity and thereby its profundity. It's true that the writing of Eden abstracts from recognizable socio-historical coordinates, whether psychological, political, or anthropological. But it would be a mistake to infer from this that it lays claim to an external perspective upon human history. In fact, history is rendered all the more present in the text for having been abstracted from its contemporary and therefore partial ideological representations. Guyotat has insisted that history, in its totality, be absolute history, beyond subjective or objective partiality, is the fundamental concern of all his writing. Since history in this absolute sense is unrepresentable, it can only be inscribed through writing that somehow shows the disintegration that it imposes upon its human bearers. Thus Guyotat's writing undoes the representation of history, the better to inscribe its symptomatic ravages in the shreds and fragments of bodies, societies, civilizations, which are its bearers. Guyotat reinserts the catastrophes of 20th century history, total war, genocide, mass displacement, within the absolute trauma of history, just as he reintroduces this universal trauma within the ravages of local history, an immense disorder, comprising fragments abstracted from the fault lines of geopolitical catastrophe, is turned into a synecdoche for the trauma of absolute history. The inscription of absolute history cannot unfold temporally, rather past and future, memory and anticipation, are obliterated by the constantly reiterated stitching together of acts extracted from history and an ecstatically open present. These acts are not performed by human actors and do not sum together to compose actions. Because it is not a narrative coordinated around human actors or their actions, Eden does not have a recognizable locale, whether urban or rural. The liminal zones within which the acts registered in the text unfold are the frontier post, the brothel, and the desert, zones as far removed from social order as they are from organic order. These in turn are sites for the liminal states of war, prostitution, and slavery, neither natural nor unnatural, which form the backdrop to these senselessly proliferating acts the text describes. Finally, these acts themselves, indistinctly sexual and subsexual, although performed by bodies, they cannot be attributed to persons, and although subpersonal, they cannot be assigned to organic reflexes. The acts described in the text, yapping, licking, nibbling, whimpering, swallowing parts of bodies and objects without selection or discrimination, plunge us into an element which is neither human nor non-human, yet it is a sensible element nonetheless, and therefore one which is phenomenologically apprehensible. It would be a mistake to think that Guyotat substitutes a non-human perspective for the human standpoint, or that he has simply abolished the distinction between human and non-human, In fact, Guyotat's writing operates a double abstraction, from the human into the non-human, and from the non-human into the human. It does not simply mix or confuse the human and the non-human, although this is part of its strategy. Still less does it pretend to attain the absolute in a perspectival version of reality in itself. Rather, it constructs a new kind of perspective, one that has not been attained before in writing, wherein human and non-human perspectives are folded into one another. Thus the prose of Eden unfolds from a point at which the mutually exclusive perspectives of human and non-human have been reflected back into each other, such that the human perspective is seen as if for the first time from a non-human standpoint, while this non-human standpoint is discovered from within the human perspective. The result is a parallax vision through which we are made to see the inhuman for the first time. The inhuman is the parallactic superposition of human and non-human. The concept of parallax has been used by Slavoj Žižek to describe the point at which a change in perspective on something is inscribed in the thing itself. It is not the thing that appears differently depending on one's point of view, but the difference in appearance that is the thing itself. I use the term here in related but slightly different sense, since the parallax operated through Guyotat's writing is phenomenological rather than ontological. Whether or not parallaxes are, as Žižek insists, ontologically constitutive, dissolving the distinction between phenomenology and ontology is a thorny issue which I will not discuss here. It is a phenomenological parallax because the interreflection of human and non-human perspectives operates in and through the element of sensation. Thus, Guyotat's prose concentrates sensation to achieve a limotrophic suspension of intelligibility. This involves vision, hence Eden's undeniable cinematographic aspect, as well as hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. It accentuates sensation, zooming in on peripheral sights, sounds, smells, feels, and tastes, magnifying them to the point where the foregrounding of sensation at once intensifies phenomena and blots out their intelligibility. It forces us to see the point of blindness. Paradoxically, the obscurity that results opens a blackness that was not visible before. The accumulation of sensations in the text forces us to attend to what we would rather not see, touch, taste, smell. Reddened armpits, sweating hands, cold flesh, legs splattered with blood, dragging over bones, the dismembered corpse rolling beneath the foot, the stench rising from the litter of carcasses, insects biting and stinging, eyes, nostrils, lips. The dung fly consuming the waste is the datum whose singularity gives sensible substance to what would otherwise be merely spectacular. Spectacular because it has not been rendered concretely perceptible. The corpse, the shredded flesh, the bones and carcasses. It is the presence of the dung fly that allows us to perceive a concrete sensory configuration and what would otherwise remain an abstract tableau. The intensification of perception through the cumulative separation of detail is reiterated throughout the text, inducing in the reader an anxiety about the invisibility of an obscenity that is sensed rather than seen, thereby preventing him or her from being captivated by the spectacle of obscenity. If prostitution for Guyotat is an ontological rather than social condition, then its phenomenological corollary is an obscene sensory intimacy, an obscenity in sensation rather than of the sensible. And it is this saturation of sensation that exposes the condition of exploitation. Sensation becomes the primary revelatory modality. These creatures in the text, turning, snorting, advancing, sweating, peering, sucking, and whores, heads wrapped, bagged, parceled up like merchandise, dimly peering through moistened tissue, snorting the snot spreading from their crushed nostrils to their curled upper lips, sucking breaths filtered through embalmed respiratory tracts. Guyotat's writing configures sensation to let us see what consciousness prevents us from seeing, but also to prevent us from looking at what our unconscious wants to see because it is forbidden. It constructs a hetero-phenomenology of sensation that subverts the authority of first-person consciousness, just as it curbs the impersonal power of the unconscious. This hetero-phenomenology discloses corporeal sensations from a perspective that does not belong to any embodied subject. Through it, Guyotat exposes an injustice with the sensible, one that is as imperceptible for the law governing the intelligible as it is for the power controlling the sensible. Guyotat's name for this aboriginal justice is slavery. Slavery is neither human nor non-human. It is the name of the inhuman, whose gleaming blackness Guyotat's prose allows us to see. Slavery's inadmissibility with the human order mirrors its existence within the natural order. What is, but should not be, within the former, exploitation, is the inverted echo of what should be, but is not within the latter, predation. Predation is the rule of the absence of law, thus the rule of law entails abolishing the rule of predation. Exploitation is natural, as predation's rule over the law that is supposed to abolish it. Indeed, for Nietzsche, law itself is only the sublimated reassertion of predatory rule. Law's attempted abolition of predation merely reasserts it. It is possible then to affirm the injustice of exploitation and the necessity of law without thereby reasserting the rule of predation through the law that seeks to abolish its necessity in nature. Question. This is a question. It is, but only once we realize that predation is not a rule, and therefore is unnecessary, because all necessity derives from law. Thus, justice need not abolish predation, merely circumscribe it. Predation is circumscribed by asserting the exploitation's distinction from predation. Slavery is not just predation, law is not just force, justice is not just power. Through this differentiation, the law that delimits predation need not unwittingly reinstate it. The veritable abolition of slavery is the abolition of the abolition of predation. Thus, the justice that abolishes slavery does not reinstate predation because it recognizes the necessity of its injustice, which is to say, the contingency of the rule of predation. Nature is not lawful, thus law is not bound to it, certainly not bound to repeat the predatory rule mistaken for law. Exploitation is unjust because it is not predation. Predation is unjust because it is not, because it is natural, which is to say, it is unnecessary. Thus, abolishing exploitation is necessary because predation, not just despite, but because of its predominance throughout nature, is not. This dialectic is recapitulated in Guyotat's writing. It allows him to maintain the continuity between man and nature, human and non-human, while affirming the discontinuity between exploitation and predation. This discontinuity is attested to by Guyotat's prose insofar as it reveals the invisible form latent not only in the content of sensation but also in the consciousness of that content. This invisible form is the dialectical articulation of exploitation and predation, law, and nature, which allows us to perceive slavery as inhuman while simultaneously recognizing this perception of the inhuman as the inception of justice. Perceiving the inhuman as unjust obliges us to recognize this perception as just. Thus, to perceive the inhuman as unjust is also to recognize its perception as just. Consequently, the inhuman cannot be abolished without also abolishing justice. The inhuman is the dimension within which slavery is the condition of emancipation. Because recognition and perception are indissociable, it is impossible to separate the justice of inhumanity from its injustice. This inseparability follows from Guyotat's paralectic superposition of human and non-human perspectives. It is the condition for the supersession of the disjunction between fact and norm, the disjunction which is constitutive of all human history, announced in the Tomacek epigram, which is the book's opening inscription. And now we are no longer slaves. Eden, Eden, Eden is the inscription of a present from the perspective of a future in which slavery will have been abolished, the present in which it will not be true to say we should not be slaves despite the fact that we are, because slavery is an ontological condition, as well as the hiatus between what is and what ought to be. That will have been abolished without plunging us back into nature, or the rule of predation. Thus, this is not a reiteration of Lyotard's contrast between the good and bad in human, i.e. the infinitely other and from capitalism. Because the inhuman is just as unjust and unjust as just, it cannot be parceled out into this distinction between good and bad. Thus, Guyotat's writing subverts the opposition between human law and non-human lawlessness, but he does not do so by simply collapsing or dissolving the distinction. As those who lament the bifurcation of nature in the name of some mythical prelapsarian harmony are wont to, but by inscribing the prose in superposition of perspectives, whereby what is non-human exposes the injustice in what is human, while what is human reveals the justice in the non-human. The inhuman is the name for this superposition. Eden, 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 inscribed an inhuman present, one without past or future, regret or hope, but this inhuman present is the necessarily traumatic inscription on absolute history. In a montage of hallucinatory beauty at the book's close, Guyotat's prose configures a boy, a woman, a slave, a baby, a camel, a monkey, a star, together with the wind, sand, night, and rain, stitching together the organic and the inorganic, individuated beings and non-individual elements in an uncircumscribed present, loosening the intractable grip of sensation and allowing the blackness of the inhuman to gleam momentarily. The book's final image, a whimpering monkey, muzzle bloodied, arms drooping, sex erect, trampling over headless vipers, staring with one eye at an evening star veiled in violet vapors as sheets of rain recede towards it. But we now see animal and star in a way we did not before. We see them in terms of the absence of the human or the presence of the non-human. We see them in the element of the inhuman, hitherto invisible, but now gleaming as the form within which individual and non-individual, organic and inorganic, justice and injustice are mutually transfigured.